I don't know how fresh my face is, but I'll take the compliment. Hey, thanks everyone. Excuse me. Thanks for coming out today, and thanks Alexi for hosting IBM and allowing us to sponsor this great event. I've been following this thriving community now for the last, I want to say, almost 4 or 5 years since the emergence of Hadoop and open source analytics, as I call it. It's pretty exciting to see where we're at. In the steps to kind of reimagine what we can do with data. I don't know what's going on behind me, so I'll just keep talking. But anyways, it's pretty cool. So as Alexi mentioned, we have a lot going on at IBM. We have a garage here in Galvanize called the Bluemix Garage. So if you haven't gone over there to see it and you're around today, I encourage you to go check it out. So basically around this time last year, we announced our investment in Apache Spark. How many of you, this light is really bright, how many of you have heard of Apache Spark before? Wow, okay, good, everyone. So internally, we've been talking like, do data scientists and data engineers really use Apache Spark, or is it more of like this low-level kind of engineering thing? So it's pleasing to see that it's being adopted. How many of you would consider yourself data scientists? Wow, okay, that's a good amount. So it seems like the community is growing, so that's awesome. Good work, Alexi. So as I mentioned, we announced our investment in Apache Spark last year. And the way I see it is, early in the 60s, we invested in a platform called System 360. It sounds pretty dated when I say it, because I wasn't alive when we did that. But what that did for, the information community at that time was create an operating system, really, for people to build systems and integrated systems on, right? And what's interesting is not only did that operating system create an easier way for people to essentially program information systems, it also launched the whole discipline of information science. And what's interesting about that is that's what's actually carried us essentially up until now, I would argue, right? I mean, for the last 50 years, really, and that's a long time, right? And so what we're seeing, and then what we saw was around the 90s, people looked at, System 360. It was very heavy. It was a heavy system, and that's when Unix came on the scene, across the bay here in Berkeley, where they, had the BSD license. They open sourced this system, and what was interesting is, Linus Torvalds went over and tried to use Unix, right, himself on his own machine, just like all of you have your own machines and want to do analytics. He looked at this, large operating system and said, I can't use Unix, so I'm going to build my own called Linux, right, named after himself. And that became pervasive. And why did it become pervasive? My hypothesis is that it became pervasive because he created a community, and it was free, and it was available, and people started building applications. And in my mind, that's really what launched the age of the internet. Really, it launched computer science, I would say, as a discipline. Up until that point, that was around the time I was actually in college. And I remember, as I was in electrical engineering and looking across the street and seeing, the computer science building going up at the University of Washington. So in our lifetime, right, we already saw computer science kind of take hold, and that's, no one would have imagined, I don't think Linus would have imagined, Facebook or Twitter or Amazon or any of these, companies that exist today that took advantage of that operating system, right, Linux. So, my thesis now is that Apache Spark is really emerging as the, analytics operating system. I use that, and I know people kind of throw stones at me when I say something like that, because like, oh, well, an operating system follows these characteristics. Well, if you look at, what happened with Hadoop, it was exactly like Unix, right? It was this heavy, like no one has Hadoop installed. How many of you have Hadoop installed on your laptops? A few. Okay, so it's not a pleasurable experience, and I would argue that it's not necessarily the best use of Hadoop on a single, on a laptop, right? So what happened, essentially a bunch of, smarter people than myself, Matei and others, came up with Apache Spark because they looked at it as saying, that's not a very easy, system to program on, right? The, MapReduce was pretty painful to use, right? And so they came up with Apache Spark, and I think a lot of the comparisons with Hadoop are are fair, and they tend to point to performance, but that's not really what this is about, right? What it's really about is ease of use. And that sounds like a very marketing, term, but I really believe that, and it's about data access. And so, last year, as I mentioned, we invested in Apache Spark because we needed a way, frankly, internally, to, essentially standardize, if you will, or simplify the way that we build our analytic capabilities. And those range all the way up to Watson and what we're doing with cognitive. So, Watson is using Spark, all the way down to what we're doing, in the open source, right, with our Bluemix services, like Spark as a service and these capabilities. So it's pretty exciting times at IBM. What was actually pretty exciting to see was that there wasn't like a mandate that came from Ginny or that came from, the board of directors that said, hey, you must use Spark, that's the hot thing. It was happening organically internally already. So it was actually so what I did when I joined IBM just over a year ago was I observed this. I said, look, this is organically, growing inside of IBM, and all I did was expose that to the world. I think IBM, over the past 50 years has had this kind of thinking of the not built here syndrome, and that's changing. And so I'm excited because, as Alexi mentioned, we're sponsoring more community events like these. We also launched Datapalooza last year. In fact, we just had an event in China. We were expecting 50 people. 250 people showed up. And these weren't like students or people just like kicking the tires. These were also data scientists, PhDs, researchers. So it's really taking off. We are now, I want to say, at about 6 Datapaloozas, both locally or domestically and internationally. The next one we're having is in Denver, at Galvanize in Denver, as well as in Tel Aviv. So, back in 2011 when DJ Patel said, data science is the sexiest career of our time, I believe it. It's true. And it is, what's different about the information age then in the 60s and I would call the data science era or the cognitive era today is that people are far more creative today. The technology is a lot more elastic and a lot more fluid. So it's really up to all of you to make the most out of this time, and not just the technology, but this era where people are more open, the culture is more creative, and who knows, right? What's the next Facebook, for data science, right? What does that application look like? I don't think people really have a clear idea of what that can be yet. So it's a pretty exciting time. So with that, I'm going to leave you to this awesome event. 170 speakers, that's incredible. Let's give a quick hand for Alexi for pulling this together. Nice work. And with that, I'll bring him back and we'll get started. Thanks, Alexi.